Okay, I'm Patrick Miller. I am President and CEO of Ampyx Cyber. We're going to be talking about securing critical infrastructure in a next generation threat landscape. I typically don't like the term next generation, but in this case, we actually do have a next generation threat. Next slide, please. This is my background. I'm quite busy. I'm an ex-regulator. I call myself a recovering regulator. I helped architect the NERC SIP standards starting back in 2002. I was the first NERC SIP regulator. I have many years as an actual utility staffer in various roles at electric utilities. I have experience in water, wastewater, telecom, mining, manufacturing, so several different critical infrastructures and a global presence. Still have a fair hand in various different regulatory capacities, whether it's working with the NERC SIP standards or with other countries and helping other countries advance their regulations as well. Next slide, please. So today's change, why is this a next generation threat? We've moved really from what was more or less kind of an espionage activity from a lot of the nation state adversaries. They didn't really do much in terms of, deep penetration or exploitation. There weren't a lot of 0 days used. We saw mostly what would be equivalent to something like kind of a digital vandalism, really. There were some PLCs and RTUs and other, OT devices that were hacked, but they were basically just displayed something that said kind of like you're hacked. Other than that, it was primarily what was most closely aligned with what we call espionage, just information gathering. They've moved from that to what we call digital arson, frankly. The latest attack by Russia in Poland, they did break in, I guess they kind of walked in because there was default passwords in some cases, but had there not been, they would have been a little bit deeper, I guess, sophistication to try to get in. But once they did get in, the biggest thing that was, I guess, new from this perspective in this new threat landscape is they didn't just break in and steal things or set ransomware around. They actually went in and bricked devices, right? They actually went in and permanently disabled, permanently damaged some equipment. So that's their goal, at least this Russian adversary, is pretty much destruction focused, right? And they were targeting the edge. I mean, like the actual edge of the physical interface, like the RTUs, the PLCs, these kind of places where cyber interacts with the real physical world. And if you disable those components, then basically you disable anybody's ability to not just see what's going on, but control what's going on. And then therefore, like for example, a power grid, for in this case, it would just be relying on its own designed protections, which is a very precarious state for a power system to be. With Volt Typhoon, the Chinese actor, there's various typhoons. There's Volt Typhoon, Salt, Silk, Flax. There's a variety of them. We're going to talk about at least 2 of them today. But with Volt Typhoon, this one is behaving very differently than the Russian one. They like to get in and embed themselves and hide. So looking for some sort of long-term dwell time. In the event that they want to use it, then they will use it. And they're not coming in with like 0-day exploits, for example. They are literally logging in, or they're basically taking over a device that is newly disclosed as like newly disclosed vulnerabilities. So with this particular actor, they're not coming in to burn the place down yet, right? They don't just crack the door and throw a Molotov cocktail in and run. They break in, they bury themselves, and they hide. They're not using traditional like malware payloads. Again, they're not using things like 0 days. They're living off the land, which is using the existing tools that are there, administrative tools, administrative accounts, erasing their footprints and logs, this kind of thing, so they can get in and look just like legitimate traffic and then hide as long as possible to do something in the future. Right? We haven't figured out exactly what that looks like because they haven't exercised their capabilities. But if they're there and they're deep enough, they have the capability in some cases to do extensive amounts of damage. And what this case, things like, think of like an energy management system for a power sector, like you could take over a control center, you could cause a pretty significant amount of havoc that way. So with this change, these new types of threat actors, we effectively have a detection gap. So we're not looking for things like malware signatures because they're not using malware as much. We have to monitor legitimate behavior for things that just look interesting or odd. So this new reality basically is almost all infrastructure is a battlefield. if you are a critical infrastructure company and you don't already consider yourself contested territory, you're late to the game. There are every one of the threat actors out there in these nation states, really in no uncertain terms, you are probably someone's day job. In a warehouse in Russia or China, someone has your company's internet-facing components in their sites, and likely they may be trying to get their way in right now. Next slide, please. So we'll go over the Poland attack. This one was basically, they infiltrated some internet-facing VPNs. There was no MFA, and there were some default credentials. So that wasn't particularly sophisticated. That said, this is something they could do otherwise, whether it's through harvested credentials, that kind of thing with no MFA. So standard kind of blocking and tackling will go a long way in this case. It's things like, changing default passwords and using MFA. Once they got in, they did pivot from IT to OT very quickly because there was a lot of shared administrative paths. Like they just compromise the administrative path and then get straight in from the admin creds and admin pathways. For this Poland attack, they did actually sabotage the firmware. They corrupted RTU firmware, our remote telemetry unit, which is basically like a communications aggregator or telemetry aggregator. They corrupted the firmware and basically sent these things into an infinite reboot. There were some others where they were just erasing random sections of the firmware, and then they would reboot so that the firmware was just corrupted, and then you have to go back and basically rebuild the device. So with this attack, they also did what we call safety disruption. Protective relays, they are the protection systems for the grid. They keep the grid safe. They keep the power has to operate in this narrow band, and if it can't, then protect the system. For example, like open a breaker or shut down power. When they actually start deleting configurations for these, it leaves the grid very vulnerable because there's no protection systems in place. And then the wiper phase, where they actually go through and, as I mentioned, overwrite some files. And this basically makes the recovery time as long as possible. Some of the devices, there is no recovery. Your choice is to go physically unrack it, rack up a new device, configure the device, and then try to get everything back up and running. Some of them you can just replace the firmware, but that still requires you to roll a truck. I mean, there's nothing you can do remotely in this case. And there was like 30 sites that got hit all at once in a distributed way. So that's not something you can easily do to fix things fast. Next slide, please. So the next thing I want to discuss is the death of the trusted path. We've been using what we consider kind of our trusted telecoms in a lot of ways where we just believed it was safe because it was effectively, point to point, right? It was a comm path we knew and trusted. Salt Typhoon, they compromised, I think so far, none of them have openly stated that they weren't compromised. So most, if not all, of the US telecommunications and routing infrastructure. They used what was called it's a law enforcement backdoor called Kalia. They exploited that. It has a legitimate use, but in this case, it wasn't legitimately used. It was the Chinese threat actors that got in. They were in for quite some time, and they were literally just harvesting all the data they possibly could. That intercepted the trust. They monitored that traffic between facilities on what we would traditionally consider leased lines or trusted lines. And they did use, for example, a mesh of compromised small home and office routers to bypass your standard kind of geo-blocking IP filters. What this means is all of the traffic that they did to perform this attack looked like it was coming from legitimate addresses inside the country. And what they're likely going to be doing with this is they captured as much data as they possibly could. And we're talking, more data than you think. Significant, enormous amounts of data that have just been siphoned off. And if that data was encrypted, obviously then they'd have to try to find some keys or something like that to get to it. But a lot of it isn't, because those paths were more or less considered trusted. That data has been harvested, and they're using things like AI-driven inference to try to extract as much value out of that data as they can. So if you were, for example, running unencrypted comms between your control center and your other field facilities, whether this is like a water dispatch center or a gas transmission site or electric distribution or even manufacturing locally between multiple sites, any of these things, if those comms were unencrypted, they have access to that, and then they can basically pull that out, use it to, for example, even in the Volt Typhoon approach, they can pick up what normal looks like, and they can actually start behaving more and more closely aligned to your practices, using your terminology, using all of that additional intel they can gather from capturing this much unencrypted traffic. So essentially, the short story is the path private circuits, though that's no longer considered or even remotely assumed secure. And just for the note, they didn't just do this to America. There are multiple countries. I've counted, I think around 17 of them have confirmed, and a bunch of others are still investigating. Next slide, please. So being a former regulator, what is regulation doing to try to stop this? What can regulation actually do? At least in the NERC SIP standards, the TSA pipeline security directives are doing some things. They will likely shift as well in response. They move a little bit differently than the SIP standards do. There's not much in the water space, for example. There's not much in other areas. There are some things in aviation and transportation, but we'll focus on the SIP for now. They are moving away from the prescriptive approach where it starts, these assets need to be protected. It's more or less kind of a risk picture that starts the discussion first. So instead of like a static impact level, it's going to be what is the aggregate or dynamic risk and where do you stand against that? They're definitely looking at things like mandatory multi-factor authentication. This has already been started. A new standard is being drafted, or another one will be modified to add universal MFA. And this will go down to even the low impact sites, which are traditionally a much lower profile, security profile and less controls. You'll see many more controls get added into the lower space. The reason for this is, of course, we do know that those low impact sites in aggregate can cause a problem, and that's exactly what the Russian attackers tried to do in the Poland case, was to use something of smaller aggregate, electric voltage sizes, but in aggregate done at the same time, they can have a much larger or outsized level of impact. One of the bigger ones is this, what's called Internal Network Security Monitoring, or INSM. In this one, it's about monitoring that east-west traffic to look at lateral movement between assets inside a protected zone. That's how we tell what anomalous traffic looks like, is to actually look at how these assets are communicating with each other. We've already got a lot of controls at the boundary and how to get through the boundary, and we're watching that, but what's going on inside? That's happening. And then standard things like asset hygiene, things like comprehensive inventories and baselining and config management. Next slide, please. So modern defense, we're looking at phishing resistant MFA, definitely. We got to get, identity is often heralded as the new perimeter. So we need to look at how that's done. This is going to look very different as we move to things like agents that are working in these areas. It's going to take a while for this to make it into critical infrastructure, but it will definitely get there at some point. Observability is key. You have to have something like an INSM to spot living off the land. You will not notice a threat actor who is intentionally trying to hide in legitimate traffic with legitimate accounts if you don't have something like this. And then basically zero defaults, right? Don't use default passwords anywhere. This should be known, but it needs to be pushed into practice. And of course, any unused services and that kind of thing during commissioning. Human sensors, humans get detection really well. They're better than a lot of other tools, but they need to be using additional tools to go beyond what their traditional skill sets give them. So they need to be tooled up well, and then once they're tooled up well, they can do their jobs so much better. And then things like a proactive stance, you just got to go beyond the minimums. A lot of these regulations are designed to meet the lowest bar within that infrastructure. So it doesn't apply to the most advanced. It's got to apply to the least advanced because it's something they have to be able to do. You must be this tall to ride the infrastructure ride. So we have to go beyond that and look forward into things like AI enhanced threats. Next slide, please. This is how to reach me. That's my LinkedIn. We'll go ahead and move into the discussion. Get the panelists ready to go. Next slide, please. All right. Hey, guys.
Hey, Patrick.
Hi.
Hey, Patrick.
All right. So under this backdrop, right, with this setting, let's go to the modern threats in this converged era. And converged, I know a lot of people don't like it, but there is an IT-OT convergence happening. There is essentially, I often joke that we just have T. We don't have IT or OT anymore. We just kind of have T, and it really just depends on how it's used, right? So from a modern threat perspective, we can start the discussion. One second, let me get my note. Let's first discuss the IT-OT convergence component, because this one I think is a hot button for some people and gets opinions moving fairly quickly. Let's start with you, Eric. Give me what are you thinking? What are you seeing in terms of IT/OT convergence with this kind of threat landscape as the background?
Sure, thanks, Patrick. So, just as an introduction, I've been at Keysight for 7 years. Previously, I was with Cisco for a long time and some other network equipment manufacturers, and I was on the silicon side. Our theme, dating back 20 years, was all about convergence. It was all about, hey, connect everything, get all kinds of telemetry so you can improve performance, drive down costs, expand revenue. So, I was on the other side of saying, hey, let's not have air gaps for this operational equipment that's out there. It needs to be connected. And I think we all still believe that. But of course, the attack surface for the threat actors just becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. So, I don't think there's anybody out there who's a Luddite that's going to argue that we don't want connectivity to the electrical substation, to the factory floor, to the mine, et cetera. There's many, many, many good reasons to do that, but we have to be able to protect those assets because now they're exposed to all of these threats that you just talked about, Patrick.
Yeah, fantastic. Vince, your thoughts? And please do an introduction as well. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Vince. I'm Field CTO at Corelight, focusing on network data at scale, and I came out of cybersecurity engineering roles before that. I think two things strike me around the convergence aspects. The first is, there's just a limited set of resources, right? We're all struggling to have the same people do more with less. And so I think part of the convergence is just driven by, hey, if we've got a good IT team, can't they just handle some of this OT security? Or let's put everyone together and get our heads together so we can tackle the same problems. And in many cases, they are tackling the same problems, right? It's still about visibility. It's about understanding which assets you have in your environment and prioritizing the response to those. So I think convergence is sometimes driven by necessity, but I think the really sophisticated organizations understand there are quite large differences between IT and OT security teams, and they try to separate those in various ways. The second point is just that I think there have been some industry reports that have really highlighted 70 to 80% of the attacks that we're seeing on OT infrastructure often come through converged infrastructure, right? They come through the IT side first because that's the easy way to go in. And you highlighted that in your intro, Patrick, about some of the attacks that you discussed. So it is important to not forget that even if you have separated protections and infrastructure, the attackers are going to find those single points where you forgot and you connected those, or you left some device open to the internet, and that's how they're going to get in.
Right. And Cary.
Hi, good to be on the panel with you guys. So Cary, Wright, I've been in the industry in the cybersecurity and networking space for probably around about 30 years and run products at Endace. And Endace, we focus on providing evidence for the critical infrastructure incident response process. It's all, there's pressures on teams to innovate, to be able to move fast, and converged infrastructure allows you to do that. So if you've got a big flat network, you can do lots of things. You can stand up services quickly, etc. But you pay the price. So there's definitely a balancing act between providing the right segregation, controls, segmentation, and having an environment that allows you to innovate quickly and bring up new services and capabilities quickly. And that's what I'd say most teams are struggling with. And when you move fast, sometimes you forget about the important aspects of securing your infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk a little bit about the threats. I want to kind of maybe step forward in time a little bit. We are looking at, we're on the doorstep of things like, we've gone from chatbot AI style stuff, which was, some argue that it was a glorified spell checker, still useful in a lot of ways. Now we're moving into an agentic window where you can spawn as many agents as you want to act on behalf of persons or act with machine identities. And then we're eventually going to get to something like an actual, general intelligence, right? Something that rivals human intelligence as a quote unquote being. When we've got this converged environment and we're dealing with the current threat landscape that we know of, How does it look going forward from this AI-enabled threat actor, right? Just give me some speculation in terms of what you think. And Cary, I'll start with you.
Well, yes, we're going to see all sorts of innovative threats, and we're going to see threats actually against the AI infrastructure as well. When you've got your own models, you're standing up your own private models, etc. Again, it's about moving fast and innovating, but doing it in a secure way. So we're seeing more things attached to the network. We're seeing more capabilities, and we're seeing more threats being generated. So, for instance, domain generation algorithms, they're getting smarter, being able to generate domains that look like legitimate domains that you should click on, and AI is being utilized heavily for that. So, it basically emphasizes that we need to be very carefully monitoring and understanding what's sitting on our network. The network is the common factor or the common inspection point that all threats must pass across. So, for us to get visibility into that is critical. So I think AI, agentic AI, those sort of threats don't alleviate the need to really monitor and inspect the network traffic and what we're seeing across the network as well as across our infrastructure.
Fantastic. And Vince, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think on the attacker side, you mentioned this, march and change and, growth in the technology of AI, and we're certainly seeing that. But I think on the attacker side, what we're seeing now is kind of increase in speed and increase in scale, right? So these attackers are taking the same unsophisticated techniques that you mentioned and being able to do them much faster in a much broader way. And that's really impacting what companies are seeing, right? This is literally changing from weeks or days to minutes in terms of the volume of attacks and the level of attacks that they're able to approach. But that sophistication piece is not there yet, right? The attackers are not really getting that much more sophisticated. So once that changes, once that part of the maturity really happens, then we're going to be really worried. Thankfully, as defenders, we have access to the same technology, right? And so we're all educating and learning how to work within these agentic ecosystems to protect our own organizations and as technologists, to use those tools to further our craft. So it's an arms race. I don't know who's ahead right now, but we're certainly headlong in the fight.
Yeah. Eric.
Yeah, so it's interesting because Vince is talking about the speed of the attacks and they're faster, but you were talking about how they'll remain something like Volt Typhoon. They'll get into the system and stay for as much as 300 days. We saw in one case without doing anything. So that, kind of a paradox there, right? And the change that I've seen since I've been working on critical infrastructure, cybersecurity, is really in, we used to just look at the perimeter and what was going in and out, and that seemed like that was adequate enough. But now we've realized, hey, you need to look at that internal or east-west traffic. And it previously, Corelight, for example, I didn't see them in the OT space. I was surprised a year or two ago when I saw them popping up at the same conferences, Patrick, that you and I go to pretty regularly. And I wonder what's going on there, because there's already these OT security specialist players who we partner with. But as you look at east-west traffic, the NDR solution has a major role to play. And then Endace as well. I hadn't seen them on the projects that we worked on. It seemed like logs were enough before, but now you want to have the full packet capture. So yeah, it's been interesting to watch that evolution of, and that's why we're on the webinar today with those folks. So
yeah, fantastic points. For example, MDR was one of the reasons that one of the attacks was unsuccessful in Russia. They actually had a tool, an endpoint tool on one of their engineering workstations, HMIs, and it stopped the attack at that point. They couldn't go past it. So that was useful. And the fact that they're doing everything possible to cover their tracks, having an additional escrow for logging or ability to capture as much as possible and recreate that environment, tremendously useful. I agree. I think if I were to add something, it would be the ability to use these AI tools to twin environments and model environments to use more than just, what's a better and more creative or more unique, easier, more successful attack path, which of course that's likely in terms of what the capabilities will be, but how do I model your entire environment to strike you in a way that is not just least suspected, but most impactful? Because I can now take enormous amounts of data that would seemingly be innocuous, and I can use AI to infer and fill in gaps and find a really, really damaging way to hit you hard. So just some thoughts. All right, let's go on to the next topic. I want to talk about data and detection and maybe some compliance components. If we're going to try to stop the current threats and the future threats, Eric, I'll start with you. We'll just kind of go backward. What kind of data do you think we're going to need to stop these people, right? I mean, we're looking at both. We've got known practice behaviors, known threat actor tactics from both Russia and China. What kind of data do you think is necessary to not just stop them, but even first just detect them?
Yeah. So it's interesting that you brought up digital twins and simulation. Patrick and I were both at a big conference last week called S4, which is a major industrial cybersecurity gathering of thought leaders. And you were talking about it more from the attacker's side, but I think from the defender's side as well, there's a role to play. So collecting, all sorts of data and then simulating what the attacker would do, first to be able to prevent. So keeping one step ahead of them, I think. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question on the specific type of data, but how you use that data in a simulation.
Yeah, well, what I'm thinking is if the attendees were to take away something like, what data do I need? What am I looking for? How do I go get that? What's useful? And then, obviously they'll know what they have and what they need to go get, right, in terms of technologies sets. Yeah.
Yep.
Vince, your thoughts?
Yeah. So, I mean, from an NDR perspective, right, we think of it in kind of two camps. The first is just detections, and most of those detections are focused around known vulnerabilities. So if an advanced attacker is using a known exploit for a firewall or VPN concentrator, we want to find that and highlight it and give you an alert. But that's not enough, right? You touched on anomaly detection, so baselining the behavior of a network. That's just as important in OT as it is in IT, right? And it's the way to start spotting advanced attackers in a detection-oriented fashion. So you can still get an alert that, hey, you know what, the way this person logged in was unusual. I've never seen this before. The time they logged in, the place they logged in. These sorts of anomalies are behavioral and can help identify attacks in a way that's a little more, durable than just looking for a particular specific vulnerability or alert. The second part, though, goes to what we really believe, which is that broad visibility and providing data of what's seen on the network is what you need to find advanced attackers, because they're also not going to use techniques and vulnerabilities that have been ever seen before. So if you're not able to have complete visibility on what's happening, you're not able to go back and retrospectively threat hunt or find the context of another alert or unusual situation that happened unless you've got kind of that full picture. And that includes, visibility in the network that has telemetry and detections. And it also includes, to hand over to Cary, right, having full packet when you need to go all the way down to the packet level.
Yeah. Cary.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about giving your team the tools they need to really be curious and dig into things that, they are not certain about, right? So as Vince said, we've got anomalous behavior. So when you see something that's a little bit strange or a little bit odd, your incident responders, or you probably escalate that up to tier 3, need to have the visibility and the tools there to start looking at what happened before that anomalous event. What happened after? Which hosts were involved? Where did the attack migrate to? Was it an attack, or was it just some weird behavior? And I would say we should extend this thinking to not just attacks on the network, but also look at what is residing on the network. Did someone connect a new IoT device to the network that they shouldn't have, right? Is that device vulnerable to something? Are we running insecure protocols? Do we have weak TLS encryption? These are the sort of things that you need to arm your team with to be able to start, digging into and investigating. And when they've got those sort of tools and that sort of visibility, you can often head off issues and threats before they actually occur.
Okay, agreed. Now, I had some thoughts on this one. The baselining component that was mentioned, Vince, that is required in NERC SIP. So you are now coming up in the new standard that will be effective shortly, at least for high and medium, and will eventually make its way to the low impact space, is you have to baseline the network so that you know what normal is and you know what abnormal is, right? So it's not just a good idea, it's actually a regulatory requirement for at least the electric sector. What I have seen at least is in the ONG space for the TSA-SDs, they typically treat a lot of these controls kind of like a grab bag, but they are starting to formalize this and make it a little more directive, kind of a more deterministic alignment with some of the other existing things like NIST and NERC SIP. So I do expect them to do something very similar as well. I think that's just coming up. It's coming soon to an infrastructure near you. But that sort of network baselining is also the only way you're going to detect something like a volt typhoon. There really is no other way. And you mentioned
speaking of the SIP 15.2 there, Patrick?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. SIP 15.1 as well, because 15.2 just takes it an extension beyond the boundary so that you're including the perimeter devices and any of your physical access control systems that are outside. Its name is Internal Network Security Monitoring, and that's where it starts with the first version. And the second version goes into a little bit beyond the internal components. We want to also check the boundary and the physical access control components. The other piece is there was threat hunting that was mentioned. And I always see threat hunting and incident response as kind of two sides of the same coin. And in reality, you will not find anything if you're not looking. And you have to have something to look at in order to look. So what I'm hearing is, all of this source data is really the only way you're going to detect a modern adversary, because they're not going to, if they're clumsy enough to use a known exploit, that's going to get picked up with all the tools, right? Yours included, Vince. And then if they're not, then the only way you're going to find them is to actually get the data off the wire, get it in some way modeled and shaped into a baseline approach so that you know what normal is, and then have the ability to dig deep into the pieces that you need to find all that stuff and figure out what it was. Is it an issue or is it not an issue? So I think that ties together all three of your components quite well. And I did want to add one more thing. We always talk about security just because that's our world. Those of us that have been in the OT space long enough know that this suite of tools has well beyond security benefit because it gives you operational benefit too. So you will find stuff like, this is why that RTU or PLC power cycles itself on Thursday at 4 o'clock every month. So you actually can get in there and see that real packet capture of, this is why, because this device is sending some bit string that was an error and it caused the thing to power cycle, or in some cases hang memory. So this is the operational benefit here is also tremendous. Just wanted to raise that as an issue.
Right, and I think that there were a couple of recent acquisitions of OT security firms that would indicate to me, Patrick, that that's exactly right. That it's more than just about cybersecurity. That data is going to be useful for asset management, operational effectiveness, et cetera.
Yeah. I often, when I go to management and try to get something like this suite of tools put together, I never say security to management. I always tell them this is going to basically help our operation get better, more efficient, find errors faster, root cause analysis becomes so much quicker. We're going to spend less downtime because we figured out what the problem was faster and got started sooner. All those things go into just true operational benefit. You also get the security add-on bonus as a great thing on the side. Yeah. All right.
So Patrick,
go ahead.
I was just going to say one question we often get is, how far back should they keep this data? How much data should they be collecting? We have thoughts on that, but what are your thoughts? How far back should customers be collecting logs and packet data, etc.?
Yes.
It's similar to my answer, and my answer is typically, how quickly can your team respond to these events? How with the serious events, how much time are you going to need to actually dig in and properly triage what's going on? A rule of thumb is 180 days for logs, and 14 days for packet data across your network. But that's a rule of thumb, and in my mind, you need to be thinking about what's your team. How do they go about investigating things? How underwater are they? And how do you get them above that waterline so that they can respond quickly? And often providing them that evidence, that data, allows them to get to the root cause and the root of the issue very quickly, and sometimes lifts them out of the quagmire. So it's one of those questions, isn't it?
That is actually one of the bigger questions. It's one that we're struggling with in SIP 15, to be honest, because they're trying to determine how much data do you need to keep. So when we try to actually put some boundaries on this, and at least it's a model. It's not perfect by any stretch, but at least it's a framework to start with, and we can figure out what works best going forward. But the construct is, if there is something that you're interested in, you need to keep that data for as long as you are doing the investigation. So at least in terms of duration, you do that. Now, what data do you start with? There's the ability to do kind of a risk-based determination. So for example, the security value differs on things like, if you've got an encrypted backup, okay, that link really isn't going to give you much security value other than the telemetry, the network baselining components that say, this system fires this job off on this port every day. It typically lasts this long. If there's things outside that boundary, we'll want to know, but the actual packet captures there aren't tremendously valuable. Now, for unencrypted traffic, like a lot of the actual SCADA traffic, capturing that traffic is incredibly valuable, right? And then you want to keep as much of that as you possibly can. So doing that risk-based assessment around, is this data valuable? Which data is valuable? And then keeping it as long as you possibly can, just for historical purview. So like a lot of the Volt Typhoon things, there were some, we don't know how long they were dwelling because they did not have enough log data going back long enough to see when they actually came in the front door. So, if you want to know that kind of threat kind of dwell time, you need to have as much data as you can possibly get on all those areas. So I would say first decide, what data you're going to keep, what kind of security value, what data you're going to capture and store, how you're going to store it, but keep that as long as you can, at least to determine if it's a problem. Yeah. Did you have another one, Cary?
Yeah, no, that's it is. It's how long is a piece of string, but it really depends on what you're trying to do, what you're trying to achieve, what your team's capable of. And I would add to that, it's not just a static process either. As you're automating, as you're understanding your network a lot better, and you're able to build more intelligence into your security stack, you should be becoming more efficient there. But we see all sorts of different thought trains on how long to keep that data. But you're right, You need to keep it as long as you can, but specific to that particular threat that you're investigating.
Right, and some are worried about things like legal issues or discoverability issues. There are also constructs around making that data available outside the organization. So that's not always a great reason for deleting data too soon. Most of it is just, if you have the capacity, store it as much as you possibly can. Yeah.
I think we often see, that receding data horizon, can depend on the fidelity of the data. So of course you could keep PCAP for a couple of weeks. You could keep, Corelight metadata for years potentially. And then you could also trail that off and say, we're just going to keep kind of NetFlow or light connection records beyond that. And we're going to try to keep that for even longer, 5 years, right? And so thinking about the data systematically and how it fits into your operation is really important.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's go to the next topic, and this is more about the architecture. So if we need to get this data, we talked about what kind and how long to keep it and the value of different types. But if we need to get this data, how do we get this data off the environment, like out of the different, because typically all the systems, they have to talk over the wire, or we're really not that concerned about them, right? They're air gap, we don't care. If they're isolated, we don't care. So how do we get the data off these systems? And in OT environments, you can't just go re-architect the network. It's just not how this works. They're very, in some cases, even just adding something will void the warranty from the manufacturer's footprint as to how they've designed that system. So how do we do this without impacting the architecture or causing those really well-known OT problems? And Eric, I'll start with you first.
Sure, that's kind of a layup for a Keysight person to answer that question, because you can direct connect the security tools to the switches using spans, but we see a lot of disadvantages with that. So we would argue put a visibility layer in. You can use taps in place of spans, and then put an aggregation layer in, so that you get clean copies of your data. You can filter, you can deduplicate, optimize that data before it goes to the tools. We're seeing in some of the customers we're working with, now they've got multiple tools. They've got 5, 6 tools they need to connect to. So do you really want to direct connect between each tool and each switch? I would argue no. So the final piece that I'll give on that question is just, to the extent you can be forward looking and put that infrastructure in place first, because there's kind of two different models. That type of customer that puts that data foundation there, and then that gives them ultimate flexibility on which tools they can use and mix and match, et cetera, versus starting out with the security and then running into a lot of complexity, a lot of issues. And then, we're kind of the fire department in that case that's called in late to help fix those problems. So obviously a better approach is the forward-looking, foundational approach with the visibility layer.
Yeah. Vince?
Yeah, and obviously we build off of that visibility layer as one of those tools, right? And I think one of the benefits that was kind of implied there, but not explicitly stated, was the ability to do this passively, right? That's yes, there is the not disrupting operations component, but there's also the cyber component of that, which means you have complete accountability for that data. There's no way an attacker can modify or change data that has been collected passively off the network. So that's an important component of knowing how that data is created and maintaining it across time. The last thing I'll say is just in a hybrid environment, which many of us are operating in, right? Collecting that data might be done in the cloud, it might be done on-prem, might be done in an IT or an OT environment, and being able to have that kind of visibility and use your tools across all those environments is something that we see as very important to customers, right? They want their security teams to be operating with the same data across those same environments, across all those environments that they're running in, so that they don't have to be switching between tools and data formats and ways to do the analysis. Yeah,
agreed. And Cary.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. Yeah, definitely passive monitoring the network. That's how you get a really good visibility of what's going on. Endace obviously sits as part of that architecture as well, often fed by a packet broker like a Keysight. The advantage in that is you can run your monitoring tools in a completely separate network, right? So you don't want to tip off the attackers or the people trying to get into your network that you're actually monitoring them. And more importantly, you want to protect the data that those tools are collecting from being attacked themselves, right? So having that on a separate segment, a separate network that's not accessible from that same OT network or IT network is important. And then making sure that those tools themselves are secured. For instance, we've gone through a lot of effort to get common criteria, NIAP and FIPS certification on the Endace products, right? And I know many of you others have done the same. That's to ensure that data that's captured, which is highly valuable data, right? You can imagine if an attacker gets hold of the PCAP data or the logs, or is able to redirect the Keysight packet broker, that would be catastrophic. You don't want to expose that sort of information. So making sure those monitoring security networks are secure in themselves is critical, and keeping them off to the side is one key way to do that.
Okay, all great suggestions. I'll add, Eric, the switch versus tap thing. I mean, there's so many reasons for this, not the least of which is, of course, the switch is going to prioritize, backplane traffic versus spanning if it's under duress. And one of the attack methods for Poland was a DOS attack inside the network. So it was designed to try to blind the tools by overloading them with traffic. So it's not like, this could happen. It's actively happening by the threat actors right now. That is one of their methods. So the tap does that obviously passively, and it goes to Cary's point of making it something separate. It's a not accessible, and it doesn't give automatic visibility to the threat actor that you're monitoring them. But I think one of the really key points there is there's no compliance footprint for a tap, because it doesn't actually have it's not what's called a programmable electronic device from a NERC SIP perspective. So it doesn't add to your mix of assets that you have to manage and all this. So you can literally add these in and not impact your compliance footprint, but get all the security and operational benefit out of it just by doing it that way. That's a key piece. Now, the other one I wanted to mention was the fact that, for example, Cary, you mentioned this data escrow component, and Endace you did too. Getting that high fidelity data about the network, about what's happening, that is, not only is it the right way to do it, right? Because you need to know that is intact and it has not been modified. Again, known threat actor adversary activity is to erase their logs. Try to find a way to actually either overflow the log or to erase their specific line items, for example, to cover their tracks. This is also required in SIP 15, that you have to have some way to guarantee the integrity of that log data. So this is another requirement, regulatory requirement around it as well. So we're hitting all the buttons on SIP 15. And then the last thing is that you mentioned, Vince, the common tool sets and common skill sets. I see this all the time. We started out with like an OT specific SOC, and now we see a lot are like, I can't afford that. I want to converge this. Plus I want the skill sets to go back and forth so that IT can see what's going on in OT and OT can see what's going on in IT. Because as you mentioned earlier, the threat actors 90+% of the time, if not more, are going to come from IT to OT. That's so far been the most well-documented path. All right. Any last points before we move to the next topic?
No, just wanted to ask, Patrick, you mentioned TSA and pipelines, oil and gas, but what about other sectors beyond electric, beyond that? Either, do they have emerging regulations that are similar, or even if they don't, should they be adopting this practice anyway, just because it's good practice? And
yeah, in general, those are the only ones that have, I guess, more regulatory weight. There are some in rail, aviation, and maritime, and they do have I would say, a fair degree of teeth, and they are required, right? But they're in terms of the penalty structures and what it looks like from an enforcement component, looks a lot different. So yes, they are there, and yes, you do need to do them. But they don't carry the same degree of like heft as the TSA pipeline security directives or NERC SIP. That's pretty much it. Water they tried to use the cyber performance goals out of DHS. And I would say in general, if you are in that what they call sector 5, water, wastewater, chemical, electric, and gas, if you're in any of those 5, they are trying to find a way to do common measurements. So that will be the DHS cyber performance goals are now in version 2. When an industry doesn't have a regulation, they're starting to default to that. So that's just kind of a general good practice. If you can do at least the things in there, you're hitting at least the baseline that is expected of those 5 infrastructures. Now, manufacturing, there's other things. There's critical manufacturing. There's a bunch of others. Now, I'm leaving aside the defense stuff for like CMMC and 800-171. But the rest of the other infrastructures, that's probably still a really good idea. You should at least be measuring yourself the same way. So great question. Yeah. Okay, our last topic real quick is about how to get this foundational infrastructure in place to meet these future requirements. I'm looking for things like data aggregation, readiness for medium and low, flexibility to capture IP surveillance, and then how do we get, because at some point, we're going to be talking about an enormous amount of data, especially for a large environment. How do you load balance and actually get all this data to the right place at the right time? So forward-looking infrastructures for a more mature organization that isn't just starting this, but is looking to advance their program. What would they need to do to get there? And I'm going to start with you, Cary.
Well, we need to design these monitoring networks well and scalable in ways that we can expand them as the network traffic grows, etc. We've done something similar with the Endace product line. We see customers starting off wanting to monitor a 10 gig link, and then they decide they want to have more capture depth, or they want They want to scale that up to 40 gig or 100 gig network connection. And typically we work closely with the packet broker, Keysight, for example, where we would load balance traffic across multiple devices, allow the system to scale up, and then provide ways for the users to interact as if it was one big monitoring tool. And then, of course, integrating the workflow and making sure that not just the traffic rates can scale, but the operators can scale as well. So integrating the workflow so that say a Corelight anomaly that's been flagged can be easily investigated by having a clear and easy workflow from that through to the Endace packet capture is one of the ways that we do that. So lots of different aspects to scale there.
Yeah. And Vince?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Cary said, and we operate much in the same fashion. I might take this slightly different tact on the answer, which is, something we see is, the incredible interest in automation and the, agentic SOC and where that's going. And so for us, the most critical thing to always emphasize to our customers is get this data, make sure you have it, and get the best data, which we feel like we have, because what you're going to feed into those, automated systems is going to be, the most important thing is the quality of the data, right? You can change the models, you can change the workflows, and you can have the human in the loop or not. But if you don't have the best data to be able to analyze and predict what's going to happen, then you're going to end up not having the answers you need.
Right. Great point. Eric.
Yeah, well, the changes that we've seen in the last few years in working with our customers are, it was basic aggregation at first. So we were there really where a sensor from one of the security companies just didn't have enough ports or didn't have enough bandwidth. They weren't using or buying the extra features that we have available on our packet brokers. Now we're seeing, especially deduplication. There's just a lot more traffic. You're connecting to access switches, so you're getting the same packets multiple times. Overloads the security tool. Something as simple as that. You mentioned the security cameras are going to be monitored going forward. Again, that's going to have of traffic, but not all of it needs to be captured and looked at. So filtering out. Advanced features, and then we've started to just see we're selling our bigger packet brokers that we're used to selling into the data center, into OT now, which has been kind of a surprise. We were selling the edge, smaller, cheaper boxes, but now we're seeing projects where, hey, they need, just as much horsepower as in the data center. So,
yeah, I do see, as we want to start aggregating everything and we can use AI to see across more things and correlate more things, it's going to be, we want to get all the things we possibly can and somehow getting all of that the right way. And then baselined and then actually captured where necessary, I think is going to be key. All right, we're running short on time, but I still want to get to a couple of questions. I'm going to hand it back over to Margaret.
Great. I know we're at the top of the hour, but we do want to sneak in a few questions. So I think our first question is, how are the types of attacks different that we're seeing against critical infrastructure versus more traditional enterprises?
I'll keep it short, but I'll start. Critical infrastructure was considered a red line. It was off limits for a long time until Russia did it and there were no consequences. And then it became much, much more common and frankly just became table stakes. So we're seeing a lot of the same other thing, the ransomware, for example, in critical infrastructure is now a thing. Destructive attacks are now a thing where they weren't in the past. Anyone else want to add?
I would say there's a lot of commonalities there as well, right? They're using the same vulnerabilities, they're getting in similar ways, but there's more intent there. The dwell times are longer. The obfuscation is, they're going to greater lengths. They might be sitting in the network for quite some time, dormant. You need to be able to detect that. You need to be able to investigate and threat hunt for those sort of things. So they're not necessarily different attack vectors. They're similar attack vectors. They're just being used in stealthier ways.
Yeah, I think one notable thing that's changed is these advanced attacks are coming after everyone. So I often describe that just because you're a smaller player in either, a critical infrastructure role or an enterprise role doesn't mean these guys aren't coming after you. They cast a very wide net across the entire world to get whatever information and sow disruption that they can.
Yeah, and they'll use the small ones as training ground. So that's just common.
Yeah, so I guess the intent, I'll say, can be different, more financial on the enterprise side, and more about, harm, and whether that's bodily harm to people or, taking down the economy chaos, with the critical infrastructure attacks.
Great, thanks. And the next question. What are examples of threats or security issues that could only be found because you had packet data?
Maybe I should take that one. Okay. That's a really good question. They're going to be the ones that are not yet defined. It could be 0 days, it could be C2 channels hiding in. So as an example, we saw one just a few months ago that was very interesting. It started off as MPEG video flying across the network, and that video stream just piqued someone's interest because the packet size of that stream was a little bit smaller than it should have been. So we had one of our incident responders dig into that and try and reassemble it back into an actual video stream. It wasn't video at all. It turned out to be something very strange, and digging in further, it was a C2 channel utilizing a defunct instant messaging protocol, something we hadn't seen before. That instant messaging protocol had been defunct for quite a number of years, in fact, probably around 10 years. So they're the sort of things that you're going to stumble across when you start to threat hunt down at the packet layer. And I would say to be able to do that, you're going to need to put in as much automation and tool flow and intelligence as possible, because what you need to be able to do is offload your analysts from the mundane everyday tasks and free them up to start looking at these sort of threat hunt activities. So as Vince was saying before, utilizing AI to really improve the efficiency of your workflow, offload those tasks that can be done by machine, so that the humans can use the real brain power and dig into things that pique our curiosity.
Yeah, fantastic. With that, Margaret, you want to wrap us up? Sure.
Well, thank you so much. Sorry about that. Thank you on behalf of Ampyx, Cyber, Keysight, Corelight, and Endace. We appreciate all your time today. You'll be receiving a recording by email. And thanks, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.